Hello guys, this is Ben, and in this video we're going to take a look at a basic biblical worldview question. In other words, how does the Bible tell us how to view the world? So, for this one, the question we want to take a look at is, should Christians, always obey the government? And there's a follow-up question of, should Christians, set up a government that forces everyone to be Christian? Should all the laws just be, what the Bible says, kind of thing? Should there be separation of church and state? But first, we want to take a look at the question of, should Christians always obey the government? So we'll start with a Bible passage from the book of Romans in the 13th chapter, and it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities," which means do whatever they say. "For there is no authority except that which God has established." In other words, be subject means that, either the king has, who are the people that, obey the king or are the king's subjects. Alright, so the authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of the possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe to them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So the question is that, alright, this says, do whatever the government says. Every government that exists was created by God. And the obvious follow-up question is, what if I live in, somewhere like, Afghanistan, where the Taliban is the government, or we could think of, ISIS. What if I live in ISIS region, where ISIS is the government? What should I do? Whatever ISIS wants? Whatever ISIS says? Because ISIS says that merely by, if you don't know, you can go to the Clarion Project and look up ISIS's magazines in English and a variety of languages. They put out magazines in a variety of languages. There's one article in one of the magazines. It's why we hate you and why we kill you, and it's very clear that everyone who's basically not a member of ISIS needs to die. So, should you be subject to that? In other words, do what they want, because that's an authority God has established? In Nazi Germany, you were commanded to be a racist, and even turn your parents in if they spoke out against the government, and pretty bad. In Soviet Russia, you're commanded to be an atheist and not even believe in God. Well, this is a good, interpreting this passage is a good example of a basic rule of biblical interpretation is, it's safer and wiser to assume that the writer of the text is not insane. If he was insane, it would make no sense that he was able to make as much sense as he does. So in other words, Paul wrote in the first basically 8 chapters of the book of Romans, he explained very clearly what Christianity is and that you should believe it. And of course, he makes it clear that, you should spread it and preach it. He writes that in other places. No matter what happens to you. You take a look at 2 Corinthians 4 and 5 for that. And so here's the point. In the Roman Empire, and remember, the book of Romans is written to the Romans living in the city of Rome. In the Roman Empire, it was illegal to be a Christian. Being a Christian was against the law. So Paul has told us over the course of 8 chapters to break the law. And then in chapter 13, he tells us do whatever the government says, no matter what government it is, not just the governments you like, no matter what government it is. For there exists no government that wasn't instituted by God. And so we could say that Paul is contradicting himself and he, is just insane. But it's much wiser to assume that Paul isn't insane, since if he was insane, we would probably hear like all kinds of wild statements from him, like, he doesn't have to eat anymore because he's achieved some sort of superpower or something like this. So if we make the assumption that an insane man wasn't one of the greatest religious figures who ever lived, and that it was instead a sane man, then that means that he is aware that he has also, over the course of 8 chapters, told them to break the law. So the reasonable interpretation of this text is that Paul means obey the law as much as you can, but not in every single way. That's the reasonable assumption. Or rather, interpretation. That's the most rational interpretation. Someone might say to me, well, how do you know for sure that it was illegal in the Roman Empire to be a Christian? Where are you getting that from? And, they might say something like, you're just making that up, or how will people who don't have access to all sorts of history textbooks or, history documentaries or something, or the internet, be able to know that? Well, they wouldn't actually need all of that extra biblical information to know that, since Paul makes it quite clear in numerous other biblical texts that that is the case. And it is oftentimes the assumption of Paul that the reader is highly familiar with the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Of course, the book of Romans is addressed to the city of Rome, the Christians that are in the city of Rome. And a basic rule of interpretation of the Bible and of just ancient texts in general is you have to do the historical exegesis first before you do the larger hermeneutic, which is fancy words that just mean you have to figure out what it meant for the people it was written to before you figure out what it means for you, and that it cannot mean anything for you that it did not mean for them. So in other words, how would the Romans have understood this? Because the Romans that he wrote to, they would have known all too well, that it's illegal to be a Christian. They would have known that clearly. In the time of the Roman Empire, the population of the empire overall was about 80 to 90% slaves. So in other words, the citizens of Rome were outnumbered by the slaves of those citizens by a factor of about 5 to 1. On the Italian peninsula, the ratio was a little different, and it was about 60% slaves. So in other words, there were way more citizens in the Italian peninsula. And this was largely due to just the city of Rome, which approached about 1 million inhabitants. And there was only one other city, I think, in the entire Western Roman Empire that got up to 30,000, or over 30,000 people. So most of these cities weren't really cities. They were more like military outposts to maintain Roman power, because you have to be a very powerful military to maintain control of a slave population that outnumbers you 5 to 1. The Romans were, of course, very proud of this. Now, in the Eastern Empire, the slaves were, the cities, there were more cities. There were ancient cities. Alexandria, founded by, Alexander the Great, centuries earlier. Athens, you get the idea. Even Jerusalem, right? But in the Western Empire, it was quite different. Now, the thing is, my point is, in Rome, the authority of the Roman Empire would have felt stronger. In other words, like 80 to 90% for the empire overall. But in the Italian peninsula, basically the inhabitants of just the city of Rome, you have most of the powerful people living there. So, in other words, this is a city where all the slave masters live in the lap of luxury with a largely idle population. This is a time when most of the long distance trade is just in luxury goods. There isn't really long distance commerce and that kind of thing. There was one example where the city was undergoing a famine and didn't have food, and some ships came in with from Egypt, which was a breadbasket region for the Emperor Nero, but it turned out that they were just loaded with sand for the Emperor Nero to watch wrestling on actual Egyptian sand. I think some riots broke out over that because there were famines in the city. The birth rate for the slave population was actually terrible in the Roman Empire because these were slaves, and this was a harsh form of slavery. This wasn't one of those, oh, they were really free servants, or almost free servants. No, they were this was a cruel form of slavery. Birth rates were terrible among slaves, but there was always more slaves to get from, the frontiers and that kind of thing. So you see, my point is that the people that this letter of Paul was written to is not you. It doesn't say to Ben Joyner. It says to the Christians in Rome. Okay? God, as Christians, we believe that God inspired this and oversaw that it was for us, but it is not written to us. And therefore, it doesn't mean anything for us that it didn't mean for them. And the only way you can justify, you could say that, like, well, God inspired and actually hid something in there that was not the intent of the author. And that's fine, but, like, you have to actually prove that is in there. That shouldn't be the standard assumption. Okay? Because the way this text works is it makes itself clear what it is. It's a letter to the Christians in Rome. So my point is that for the Christians in Rome, it would have been blatantly obvious that it's illegal to be a Christian. And so when Paul says submit to the authorities, he doesn't mean stop being a Christian. He doesn't mean do whatever they say. He means submit to them as much as you can. So understanding that situation helps us apply it for us as we move forward. Because the larger question is, all right, as Christians, what laws should we break? What laws should we not agree with? That kind of thing, Well, we go back to the basic concept that Paul's laid down here. You obey God, first and foremost. But as much as you can, as much as it doesn't disagree with your requirement to obey God, then you obey the government. Christianity is not a religion that teaches political rebellion. Rather, it teaches very clearly that you are to obey the government as much as possible, as long as there's not a conflict with what God wants. Which means it's important for you to know what the requirements of God are on your life. That sort of thing. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because we, as Christians, need to look further at this, because it says this is also why you pay taxes. All right. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. In the despotic, tyrannical slave economy of the Roman Empire, the citizens of Rome were not productive individuals. Rather, their position was that you take what you want and you're proud of your ability to take it. So it was very much like a mafia. Okay? Think of it like a sort of evil empire, or like a parallel evil universe. Okay? In this parallel evil universe, how do the wealthy and the rich survive? Because the slaves provide them with whatever they want/need. And they lived extravagantly. We see that. So, what this means is the paying of taxes is a primary way that slavery functions. In other words, you're not necessarily locked in a barn or something, and then you're let out to work some field for the master, and then you're put back in the barn every night. But rather, you work, and then, ta-da, they take everything. See how it works? Or you pay taxes, or you pay, you're not going to get ahead, you're not going to get rich farming your land or whatever, industry you're in. You're not going to get rich. They're just going to take everything. So, understand this. So, when Paul says pay your taxes, it's like don't rebel against the government. Don't rebel against slavery, against being a slave. So it becomes interesting. In the Roman Empire, the primary justification that the emperor gave for his authority was that the gods had put him in charge. And so the official religion of Rome was called the imperial court. In other words, the emperor was seen either as a god himself or as the divine emissary of the gods, put in charge by the gods. And in the cases where he claimed to be a god, it was believed that without his prayers, the sun would not rise. So, in this is the context of the book of Romans. In this world, if you say you don't believe in the Roman gods, then you are a rebel against the entire political system. That is in other words, for the Roman political system, the religion is the justification for the authority of the government. The government's authority rests on the fact that the gods are in control, and therefore the gods put the government in control and the emperor in control, and therefore that is why you do what they say. If you worship a different god and you don't worship those gods, then you are a rebel against the very foundation of the entire government. So, under Roman law, if you were a Christian, then your official crime was called atheism, which is an older Greek word, and the Greeks had the same laws. Essentially, if you don't worship the official government gods, then you are against the gods or without the gods. You are an atheist. So Christians were jailed, in some cases executed. Female Christians oftentimes were forced into prostitution because they were atheists. So it is inherent in the fact that you are a Christian that you are also a rebel against the entire Roman Empire. And so Paul is coming in and saying, you do not rebel against the entire Roman Empire. that this religion of Christianity is not something that is going to cause you to change your political affiliation. What he does is he gives a Christian justification for obeying the government, even though it is a government that justifies itself differently. What Paul says is these people are only in authority because God has put them there, and therefore you obey them. He does not mean that you will do everything they say, or you agree with everything they say, or that you be subject to everything they say. But he does mean that as much as you can, you do. And so this becomes quite interesting for Christians. What do we do? What do we do? Now, the interesting thing is Paul's telling them not to rebel against slavery here, and he says it in other places. And so, the issue of slavery is quite prominent in an empire where 80 to 90% of the people are slaves. And then the entire justification for the authority of the empire is based on Roman gods. And then you decide you will not worship or revere in any way that God, and you instead revere a different God. Well, it would seem that you are no longer their slave. You no longer do what they say. That kind of thing. Since Paul insists on not dissolving slavery, and that, in other words, that Christianity is not going to become a movement to stop slavery in the Roman Empire by political rebellion, then what we have is a situation where he's making it clear, and this is what's interesting. This is really the separation of church and state. That, yes, you revere God, and yes, you obey the government, even though you may not agree with everything the government does. That those are two separate issues, and that the government is ultimately the government is only in power because God allows them to be, and you obey the government as much as you can. But when it conflicts with something God wants you to do, then you do what God wants you to do. So, on the issue of slavery, probably one of the main passages to look at would be in the book of Ephesians. Hold on, let me find it. Okay, so he talks about the treatment between husbands and wives in chapter 5. Then he talks about children and their parents in chapter 6. And then in chapter 6, verse 5, he says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." So, it would seem that Paul is justifying slavery. But you have to read on. He says, "Obey them, not only to win the favor win their eyes on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart." So in other words, he says, you are not their slave. You obey them as you would obey Christ, because you're really a slave of Christ. And you obey them with your whole heart, because Christ, you are really a slave of Christ. And so again, the idea, the assumption here is that slavery is gone as a Christian. But if you are a Roman slave who becomes a Christian, you don't run away or rebel or try to kill your masters or overthrow the government. Instead, you obey the masters now, but not because they tell you to, or not because the Greek or the Roman gods put the Roman government in place that owns you. No, now Christ owns you. But Christ wants you to still obey them. And you're Christ's slave. And then he gives a reason why Christ wants you to obey them. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever they do, whether they are slave or free. In other words, from God's perspective, it's not going to be despotic and tyrannical. He goes on to say, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So, it's very interesting. Treat your slaves in the same way. What do you mean, treat your slaves in the same way? Oh, he's preaching equality. In other words, he's saying, you slaves who are Christians now, and the masters who are Christians now, the relationship between you is one of equality. You maintain this household, you maintain this arrangement, but you treat each other as total equals. Treat your slaves in the same way. In other words, the slave obeys the master as he would Christ, but the master treats him the same way. Because you know, and he says, do not threaten them, do not threaten your slave, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. He will not favor you over them. So, what Paul tells us in other places is that you can actually the master can win the slave over to Christ by treating them well. And that the slave can win the master over to Christ by treating them well. And then within this household, this effectively would eliminate the slavery. But Christianity is not a war of political force. Rather, Christianity is to be spread by love and by Christian living and Christian virtues and that sort of thing. And so, this is how it works. Paul's saying you don't overthrow the government just because the government does things that you don't agree with. But on an individual, real-life basis, you can change how people live with the love of Christ. And it may not solve all the problems. You may not politically overthrow the government, but what you're going to do is change the situation in your household. And that'll spread to another household. And that'll spread to another household. And that's how real change in a culture happens. Because if the laws in America, for example, once upon a time, they made it illegal to drink alcohol in America. The problem was that everybody still wanted to drink alcohol, so it didn't really affect anything. In fact, they said alcohol sales went up because of prohibition. You can imagine, what if they, for example, what if they made it mandatory to be homosexual? Well, I bet a lot of people just wouldn't do it. Police and all. The government just doesn't have that kind of power to just do whatever, as much as some conspiracy theorists would like you to think that. So, the question that arises for us at this point is what do we do? When specifically do we disobey the government? Now that we have some of this background information, so we can see that, the model that we have here from Paul is even if it's tyrannical and oppressive and horrible, our job is not to try and overthrow the government. It's rather to try and win people over. That Christianity is not to be spread by the sword and by force and by military might, but rather by love and by changing people, getting people to willingly change their ways, getting the masters to willingly, stop hurting their slaves. And also the master, by treating the slave well, is going to willingly get the slave to change. So, there you go. But the bigger question, and the question that Christianity faced after the time of Paul, was, what happens after that? What happens when the government is Christian? what happens when pretty much everybody in the nation is Christian? Well, it would seem that a Christian government shouldn't have slavery or that kind of thing. And, so what happened as Christianity, this is what happened with slavery as best I understand it. The Roman Empire, its army slowly weakened as it slowly fell apart. As this happened, slavery went away because there was no army to enforce it. And the empire actually had to start shifting to paid labor. Eventually, the empire became so weak that various barbarian warlords from Germania, as the Romans would say, Germany as we would say, carved out various kingdoms. Eventually, these kingdoms fought one another, and what emerged essentially over time became the political landscape of Europe, the various barbarian kingdoms. But these barbarians brought slavery back in a big way, and if anything, it was perhaps, from what I understand it, more harsh than slavery was beforehand. The first barbarian warlord to convert to Christianity was the king of the Franks. His name was Clovis. There was a famous battle. Now, the kingdom of the Franks eventually became France. It probably wouldn't have happened except for this battle went, the way that it did. There are a few stories about this famous battle, but there was a big battle between the Franks and another barbarian tribe called the Alemanni. And the Alemanni, in this story, there's two stories about, they give a miraculous explanation for why the Franks won the war. One has one of the barbarian warriors has a special axe because the barbarians love their throwing axes. And on this axe he had magic words with magic letters written called runes. And the runes were, for these people, it was not really a developed written language like it would later become for the Norse further north. For them, it was just very secret, very magic words that Odin had taught them to help them be mighty warriors for religious reasons that had to do with Odin. But one of the warriors threw his magic axe with the magic letters on it that would make it have magic abilities. It was a blessed sacred axe. And the axe flew and struck the Alemanni king, and the Franks won the day. That's one of the stories. Another one of the stories is that the king of the Franks, Clovis, in the heat of battle, pulled a sort of Constantine-like move and decided, you know what, I'm done. And he had a hog-tooth necklace on, which was another magic item, that they would have gotten from Odin, learned about from Odin. But he snatched the hog-tooth necklace off, threw it on the ground because he was done following Odin, and he, I think, picked up a cross or something and decided that that was his religious symbol, and he fought in the name of Christ. And that was the explanation for the mighty victory over the Alemanni. So it's argued that perhaps Clovis really converted to Christianity for political reasons, because after winning this battle, a lot of the citizens of the region that he now ruled were Christians. And so what Clovis wound up doing was most likely becoming a Christian for political reasons, to consolidate his political power over this Christian population. Say, I'm one of you, I'm with you guys. He got baptized, in the church and everything. And he married a Christian woman who was actually a former slave. And her name was Bathilda. and she's actually from Britannia, what the Romans would have called it. Eventually it would become known as England. Although I think in her day it would have been various English kingdoms. And by the way, the English were those were just different barbarian warlords. So Clovis is a big turning point, because this is a turning point from when these barbarian warlords who worship Thor and Odin and all this, this is when Christianity has spread to the point that they're actually having to they're actually becoming Christianized. They're getting baptized and all this. So Clovis dies, and his son is not old enough to take the throne, and so his wife Bathilda has to serve as what's called a regent, I guess. And so what that means is she's not the queen in charge so much as, but she's in charge until the little boy is old enough to take the job. During her time, she does a lot of work to feed the poor and to just a lot of charity work. And then she outlaws slavery within the kingdom of the Franks. She makes it illegal to own slaves within her kingdom. And for her actions, the church, at the time, we might call it the Catholic Church today, but in those days it's just the church, although I think they did refer to themselves as the Catholic Church. And the term Catholic just means whole, so the Catholic Church is like the whole church. So that's kind of exclusivistic when you think about it. But anyway, they made her a saint, and so now she's Saint Bathilda, and she's sainted for her desire to help the poor and the underprivileged in society, and for freeing slaves, and for outlawing slavery within her society, within her kingdom. The kingdom of the Franks was nowhere near as big as as France is today. I think it was basically sort of the region around Paris at the time. So, not even all the way to the northern coast. So, that's really the question that we want to address now. Did she do the ethical thing as the Christian ruler? Now that she was the queen, now that Clovis, was a Christian, but maybe he was a fake Christian, but she was apparently a real Christian. Did she do what was right? Well, slavery is a moral evil, but Paul's perspective on this was that you don't politically enforce Christian values, rather you spread them through one person at a time, and people will willingly change their ways. But what do you do when it's a kingdom, or we would say today a nation of Christians, and what do you do when the ruler or the government is Christian? Is it right to make laws in accordance with Christianity? Most of us today would say, well, no, we have separation of church and state. That's wrong. You can't just make Christian laws, and you can't tell people, that they have to be Christian. How dare you? How dare you? How dare you? Right? But in her day, slavery was one of those laws where people would have said, how dare you? In other words, abolishing slavery was one of those laws where people would have said, how dare you? So, like for us today, we say, yeah, you can't force people to be Christians. So, like, we say things like, you can't force kids in school to have to hear a preacher preach the gospel, or you can't tell them they have to pray, the blessing over their lunch. That's forcing your religion on people, and people have religious liberty to believe whatever they want to believe. In Bathilda's day, banning slavery would have been like forcing your religious beliefs on people. She was shoving her religion down people's throat, to put it in a modern vernacular. All the barbarians were fine with slavery. They had brought it back in a more severe way than the Romans had even had it originally, which is pretty bad. And who is this upstart Christian to shove her religion down everyone's throat? Yeah, I'm sure Christians believe that, all people are created in God's image, and therefore you can't buy a person. But this is where rational theology becomes important. What Augustine, or St. Augustine, said, and remember, he's one of the most influential authorities on Christian thought there ever was outside of the Bible, is that God intended, and he wrote literally at the time when the Roman Empire was falling apart. His lifetime, it's like happened during his lifetime. So like he became sort of, as they say, the architect of the Middle Ages and what people thought. And so Augustine's perspective was that God would have seen to it that many diverse things would be able to be found in the scriptures. But he also insisted that we use our Christian ability to reason. He said, God separated us from the animals by virtue of our ability to reason, and it just didn't make sense to him that God wouldn't want us to use that in coming to, for our faith not to be based on reasons. And that was actually just an apologetic question, but actually more than that, our understanding of God, now that we believe in Him, and now that we believe in Jesus, what is our understanding supposed to be? Well, it's supposed to be based on reasons. And his argument was that, this is the very thing that, God used to separate us from the animals. Why wouldn't God want us to use it? In fact, the reason we can make a profession of faith in Christ and the animals can't is because we have this ability to reason. It's just fundamental. So his point of view was we have to use our reasoning in our understanding of God. That's essential to how God made us the way we are. And so here's the question. Is it moral for a government to shove their religion down people's throat from a Christian perspective? In other words, should a Christian government force people in that kingdom or nation to abide by Christian principles? Yeah, the Catholic Church made Bathilda a saint, but was she shoving her religion down people's throats? What if there were people who owned slaves, who paid a lot of money for their slaves, there were people in that kingdom who had owned slaves for a long time. Their fathers' 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 fathers had owned slaves on a certain plot of land, and that's the way it always had been. And here, who is this upstart to come in here and abolish slavery? How dare she? Now, essentially what happened is we can see from where she was that this was a clear indication that serious moral opposition to slavery had arisen in Europe. And in preaching her name, people went on to the church went on to really preach against slavery. She didn't originate the idea that slavery was wrong, but by the time you get to her, it's clear that there's a lot of political momentum behind the abolishing of slavery. And by the 900s, the Roman Catholic Church had made a proclamation that slavery is a sin and you can't do it. And they said slavery of Christians and Jews. Slavery continued on the fringes of the empire, mostly wherever there was interaction with Muslims, since of course Muhammad did own slaves. and slavery is okay in Islam. Although Muhammad did have a very strict set of rules that made the treatment of slaves very good, the fundamental idea of owning a human being was still part of Islam. As long as you can own people, you can't really believe in democracy or freedom of religion to think what you want or to say what you want, self-defense, right to trial by jury, these basic rights. They don't really make sense if you believe I can own you and like make you do whatever I want you to do. So anyway, one of the major areas of interaction between Europe and Islam was, of course, Eastern Europe, and this is where the Slavs are from, and so this is where the word slave comes from. The slave traders were Slavic peoples. So, this form of slavery continued in very little bits with basically just with slavery was virtually gone within Europe. But it continued in teeny tiny amounts wherever there was contact with foreign slaves. But it came back in a big way when the Spanish Empire decided to start making slaves in the New World. The Roman Catholic Church immediately preached against it, and soon was claiming people were excommunicated from the church for this. But the Roman Catholic Church Rome had been sacked by the Spanish Emperor, and the Spanish king had made it illegal for the Pope to publish any statements in his empire without the king's approval. And he had put clergy, I guess you could say priests and all that, and cardinals and all those guys in his empire he had put ones in who would do whatever he said. So slavery came back in a big way, even though the church preached against it. Now, here's the thing. We want to know, was what Bathilda did wrong? In what situation would it be wrong? We need to think about what Paul's motivation was. The idea for Paul's motivation was that slavery is wrong. People shouldn't be enslaved. And in fact, the Old Testament says that in Exodus, I think it's 21, that if you own a human being that's forced to work for you, then you are to be put to death. I mean, Paul, of course, believed all of that. So, and he even talks about, in the Christian household, you treat each other as equals. So, slavery's wrong. But, what's the right way to deal with this? Well, the problem is you think back to someone like Bathilda, she's the actual ruler of the government. She's the queen. So what does she do? What is she supposed to do in that situation? Is she supposed to do the pagan thing, the barbarian thing, or is she supposed to do the Christian thing? What is she supposed to do? Well, obviously she's supposed to do what she believes. Well, alright. What we need to make sense of anything like that is, a better understanding of maybe some guiding principles. What kind of guiding principles can we maybe derive from the scriptures? Well, it's important to understand that Christianity is not supposed to be spread by force. So if Bathilda, and that's what Paul's point is, so if Bathilda is going to free slaves, it's not going to be because she's forcing people to become Christians. That is absolutely essential. Christianity is not to be spread by force. But slavery is wrong. Paul sees in Romans that the abolition of slavery as secondary, and that the more important mission is the spread of Christianity, and that Christianity is to be spread by love. But Bathilda has to do something. I mean, what is she going to do? Is she going to continue something that's evil? And remember, she was a former slave from England. So, like, what is she going to do? This is a real question. You know, a slave from Anglo-Saxon England is now the ruler of the kingdom of the Franks. And is she going to say, you know what, I'm a Christian and I think slavery is wrong, and therefore no one can have slaves in my kingdom? Is that forcing her religion down people's throat or not? Where do you draw the line? Well, if we're not going to force people to become Christians, and that's clearly wrong, and that's clearly fundamental to what Paul's saying, we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason why government even exists in the first place? What is the proper function of government? If it's not to force people to be exactly what they should be, which is Christian. In other words, the virtuous life is the good life, and Christianity is the best religion. So therefore, the virtuous life is to be Christian. So therefore, should the Christian ruler force people to become Christian? No. Now, it's important to understand that a later ruler of the Franks, named Charlemagne, actually had people beheaded for continuing to be pagans. So that's clearly in violation of what Paul's teaching. But, and we've only really just deduced that from what Paul said, that, you know, it's a deduction. We've used reasoning to find that out. In other words, we combine the fact that he says, you know, be a Christian, with the fact that he says obey the government, and we recognize that he says, and when we look at these other passages about slavery, we recognize that he says Christianity is to be spread not by force, not by rebelling against the government, but by winning people over. Okay, that's the concept that overlays all of that. And God intended us to use our reason. And as long as we reason correctly, then we have to be correct. Alright, so the question is, what do we do? What do we do as Christian rulers? You know, you could look at a different situation. September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda hijackers hijack jet planes and fly them into the World Trade Center and kill 3,000 Americans, or inhabitants, I guess, American inhabitants of the World Trade Center. It is the deadliest attack in U.S. history. I think it's 1,000 more than Pearl Harbor. The deadliest attack on U.S. soil in history. And so these people believe that God told them to do that that's what God wanted them to do. So when the U.S. government says we're going to declare a war on terror and stop all of you people, then they're saying that you can't follow your religion. That your religion is unacceptable to follow. And so that's an important sort of thought experiment. You're going to have to, in government, infringe on people's religious freedom. You know, so the First Amendment may say that Congress shall make no law for the establishment of a government religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But the free exercise for the 9/11 hijackers, the free exercise of their religion is to kill as many Americans as possible. It's the same thing for ISIS. So, like, we're going to, if the government exists at all, then it has to exist to provide, at the very least, safety. You know, so, like, here's what Paul says, and he talks about it when we go back to Romans 13. There is no authority except which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Alright? Rulers hold no terror for those who do right, or for those who do wrong. So in other words, it's implied in what he's saying is that, and he even says there, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So in other words, you cannot use the Christian belief that Christians are not, in other words, Christians believe that Christianity should be spread not by force but by love, basically, by winning the argument. It's a religion. As Jesus says, the kingdom of God is within you. It's not something that like we put a flag on some ground, but it's within you. All right. I think it's Luke 17. I think. But anyway. But the government has a proper function for existing, and Paul's quite clear, to punish wrongdoers. So, okay, we got to punish wrongdoers, but at the same time, not just for not being Christian. Okay. So that's interesting. So, like, well, do we punish? In other words, like, think about it like this. Let's say that the police decide that, they've had it. And so what they do is everyone that speeds on the way to church this coming Sunday exceeds the speed limit, they go ahead and arrest them. And then the following Sunday, they have a hanging in the church parking lot. Because you know what? You're not supposed to exceed the speed limit. You're a wrongdoer, and we're here to punish you. All right. Well, if the government enforces every single virtuous requirement, in other words, if it punishes you for every single infraction of virtue, every single infraction of doing anything wrong, then essentially they are in effect going to be punishing you for not being a Christian. Because in other words, if you live your life completely perfectly in every way you at least possibly can, then you would be the perfect Christian worshiper of God and all that. And so if the government does that, then they would be spreading Christianity by force, which is clearly not what Paul's saying here. So there has to be some sort of in-betweensy. So there you go. I mean, the separation of church and state is inherent in these passages. You do have to use your reasoning, but again, why would God not want us to use our reasoning? Because Paul uses his reasoning. The apostles use their reasoning. What the apostles do is they go back to Old Testament passages and they dig in there and they reason and find prophecies about Jesus that people had not recognized before that were actually there. Thus, they establish precedent for this, that this is the way the apostles functioned. They reasoned from the scriptures. What the book of Acts tells us is that this was not something, it doesn't just give us examples of Paul doing this. We have numerous examples of Paul doing this. Even in the book of Romans, he reasons heavily in Romans chapter 4. He reasons heavily in Galatians 3 from the scriptures. But what the book of Acts tells us is that this is what Paul did every time he went to a new place. If he found a Jewish synagogue in a city or any region at all, on 3 Sabbath days, he would go there and reason with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that Christ is the Messiah and had to suffer and rise from the dead. And then it says, and some of them were converted. Or actually, and some of them were persuaded. Which the implication there is they became Christians because they were persuaded by his reasoning, explaining, and proving. Okay? So, if Paul could do that and find things that his predecessors and even his teachers hadn't found in there because he had a better understanding of Christ and had met with the risen Lord and had met with the apostles who'd been taught by the risen Lord and had put one and one together, he'd figured out other things. They're like, oh, these prophecies were about Jesus. And that's one thing they were doing constantly. They were finding prophecies about Jesus. Well, then it's okay for us to reason and find things about how to function in a Christian society from what these texts are telling us. That God oversaw what Paul wrote and put many and diverse things in there that can be found. That, prior generations may not have found in there. Well, how do we know we're right? And, maybe what I'm saying when it comes to reasoning from the scriptures and essentially progressively better understanding of God and better understanding of theology that's based on human reasoning could become a justification for me just, saying whatever I want. I could become like that guy who wrote The Shack, right? And reason away that there's even a hell. Well, no, because that would be bad reasoning. There's good reasoning and there's bad reasoning. Reasoning is not just a way for people just to say whatever they want and call it reasoning. You have to have good reasons. It has to make sense. It has to be logical. It has to be rational. Not everything's rational and logical. So in other words, if you tell me, John 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. But that he sent his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And I say to you, well, what that means is Mary had a little lamb, his fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Followed her to school one day. That wouldn't be rational. That wouldn't be reasonable. That would be unreasonable and irrational. Okay, so reason is not willy-nilly. Okay, it's not just making up whatever you want. So we can deduce a few things, a few statements. One, that Christianity is not to be spread by force. Two, that the government should punish wrongdoers, but not to the extent that they're actually just forcing everyone to be perfect. And that's a Christian view on government. Now, you might have to ask yourself, well, where do you draw the line? There's gray areas in between there. Well, that's a fair question for another time. I think it's good that we've kind of established a framework where you can start to make sense of these things. You start to make sense of the situation, and that's the key there. So we understand that it's okay to reason from the scriptures just like Paul did, just like Peter did. And we understand that it's okay to do it just like Thomas Aquinas did and Augustine and the other theologians. And that we can see clearly from this text that Christianity is not to be spread by force. But the government's role, God-given role, is to punish evildoers. You might ask yourself, well, how far does that go? You can start to zero in on it by saying, well, what will make a society completely not function? And that sort of thing. And you can start to see, if people just run around willy-nilly and become insane murderers, then, maybe they should be punished. Because if you're going to have to, stop, if you're going to exist and punish evildoers at all, there's going to be some things that are going to be on that list. Well, here's the thing. Capital punishment is something, in Genesis 9 it says that anyone who sheds man blood should have his blood shed by man. And so it's something to think about, but maybe an extension from there could say, what is the justification that Genesis 9 gives for capital punishment for murder, for executing murderers? Well, it's because they destroyed the image of God. Okay, well then it would seem that at the very least, the destruction of the image of God is very, very similar to slavery. In other words, if man is made in God's image and then you are to be executed for destroying that, then slavery is essentially believing that you could own that. that seems on the extreme violation side of things. I think it's safe to say. Another justification you could give is you could say, well, what is the position of this society overall? Are there enough people within this society that are on the side of this that, you know, and so it's the concept of majority rule, that the people who disagree with what the majority wants just have to go along with what the majority wants because that's what's most fair. You know, that like you know, in other words, like there's a lot of people in this country of America right now who really wanted Hillary Clinton to be president. Well, she didn't win, and so majority rule. Like you have to accept that Donald Trump is the president and abide by the laws and whatever effect that has on your life, because that's the concept of majority rule. You know, so I mean, some people argue that like the Native Americans came up with democracy, which is a joke because they just had a tribe. They had a council table where different warring tribes could meet and like settle their differences, but like none of the decisions of that, no one had to abide by the decisions of that council if they didn't agree with it. It was just like a place to talk out your differences. It wasn't a democratic body where you had to go by majority rule. And democracy wasn't really created by the Greeks, really, but you know, if you have 5-to-1 slaves, and then you know also of those citizens, and none of the women are voting, well then it's safe to say that that's not really democracy, because it doesn't have the belief in human individual liberty for all humans. You know, so that's not really democracy as we define it today. As we define it today, we think of democracy means that the people have a right to have a say in how they are governed. Okay, and so these concepts flow out of this, and you could start to see like, yeah, there's certain things about people's lives that shouldn't be violated, because if you can own a human being, like you begin to start to say like, well, what exactly rights do they have? I mean, what people could do anything to them and buy and sell them, and it starts to say, you start to ask yourself like, what exactly, you know, how am I not punishing wrongdoers? In other words, like if I allow slavery to continue, how is that, you know, there's going to be so much wrongdoing that goes on with that. I don't know. So I guess I better stop there because I don't really have much to say, you know, on exactly a political justification for why slavery should be abolished. Although I think it's horrible and terrible. Apart from majority rule seems like a good idea to me. And it seems inherently correct that people should have a right to have a say in how they're governed. And FYI, if you're interested, the form of government that replaced the slave economies of the barbarian warlords was something called feudalism. And under feudalism, slavery was replaced, and you went from slaves to serfs. I guess serf is where servant comes from. I don't really know. But under feudalism, it wasn't exactly like our concept of individual liberty and freedom, but it was progressing towards that. And feudalism became the dominant government form of the Middle Ages until capitalism started emerging in certain locations. The feudalism was radically different from slave tyrannical economies because the fundamental basis of feudalism was a system of shared rights and responsibilities. So like the commoner, the serf, had to get approval from the lord of the land for certain things. But then if the lord of the land wanted to make certain moves, he had to get approval from the commoners. So they had to approve of his actions and he had to approve of their actions. That was the essential, fundamental basis of feudalism. That's the bedrock of what feudalism was all about. And so it's quite different. It's not slavery. Although in feudal economies, the serfs weren't necessarily going to become rich because they didn't necessarily have private property rights. And you could make a case there, just biblically, that theft is wrong. And so, yeah, I guess you could make a case there against slavery. In the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, theft is seen as wrong. It's wrong to steal. And in fact, in what Paul says here in Romans 13, he says, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. In other words, don't steal and rob from people. Pay people what you owe them. And so it means right there. And so if you pay people what you owe them, then you can't really steal from them. And if you can't steal from people, then people have a right to private property. And a right to private property would actually fly in the face of communism and socialism, because socialism says that all property should be communally owned instead of privately owned. And under socialism, therefore, there would be no theft, because if I take something from you, well, it's not really just yours, it's also mine too. It's both ours type thing. So it's like when someone in the house, drinks all of your favorite, your 24 pack of Coca-Colas, and he says, well, it was both ours. We both put in on it, kind of thing. So private property, theft, the concept of theft entails the concept of private property, and the concept of communism and socialism directly leads to there's no such thing as theft. So the Bible's quite clear, thou shalt not steal. And even here, you pay people what you owe them. The idea that people own things and that you have to pay things. So here's the thing. As soon as you have private property, what Exodus 21 says, it says, it refers to, you cannot steal a human being. In other words, that like a person's fundamental private property is their own life, and that you can't take that from them, and their own time and their own labor. He's not talking about murdering someone. He's talking about stealing a person's labor and time and energy for yourself. That's essentially what slavery is, right? You're saying, I own you. Well, am I not supposed to own myself? Is not my time and my energy and my labor my private property to do with what I think is best? And so if I was to own a human being, then have I not stolen that human being from the owner of that private property, which would be that individual? And so it's a form of theft. So for any government to exist, you have to enforce private property rights, because otherwise it's just not going to function. Like, if anyone can just take anything from anyone, then government becomes completely dysfunctional. And so the basic private property that you have is your own life and your own time and your own energy. And so if you don't have a right to do with that what you see fit, then you don't own anything. But of course, you can't do whatever you want with it, because if not, then the government wouldn't be enforcing any rules, and then it wouldn't be punishing wrongdoers. And so you can make a case, the libertarian argument would be that, well, you can't victimize others, because, how can the government enforce private property rights without also telling some people that what they want to do with their time and energy is wrong? So in other words, if you have a bicycle and I decide that it's a great idea for me to have that bicycle, and I decide with all of my time and energy to create and construct all kinds of wonderful ways to steal your bicycle, and the government comes and arrests me and takes
and takes the bicycle and gives it back to you, then they have, in a sense, violated my individual freedom to do what I want with my time and my energy. But if they do not do that, then they are not enforcing any private property rights, and they are not punishing wrongdoers. So you begin to see the juxtaposition of these situations, and you wind up in a situation where it would seem clearly that victimization of others must be punished, but a person should be free to do what they want with their own time and energy, and they have their own private property, as long as it's, you know, not hurting others, kind of thing. And essentially, slavery would be a form of theft. And so if the government's going to, he says, this is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. Revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And he goes on to say, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So there you go. I guess we're not going to rethink too much more stuff. We better stop. Thank you for your time.